Part 4, The Evidence Trail, 500 words. The Criminal Investigation Division arrived at San Teodoro on December 19, 1944, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rutherford, a former prosecutor from Philadelphia now assigned to document Japanese war crimes in the Pacific Theater. His team consisted of 8 investigators, 3 photographers, and 4 Nisei translators. Their mission: preserve every piece of evidence that could support future prosecutions. Rutherford's methodology, documented in official CID reports, followed strict evidentiary protocols. Every document was photographed in situ before removal. Each piece of laboratory equipment was catalogued with detailed descriptions of its condition and apparent use. The examination tables, the restraints, the monitoring devices, all were documented with the precision of a criminal investigation, because that's exactly what this was. The photographic evidence proved particularly damning. Army photographers spent 3 days capturing every detail of the facility. The images showed the clinical efficiency of the operation, the organized filing system, the carefully maintained equipment, the systematic layout of the ward. But they also captured the human cost, the stained examination tables, the tiny portions of food allocated to subjects, the cells where prisoners were held between experiments. The document translation effort revealed the administrative structure behind the atrocities. Major Hiroshi Yamamoto had commanded the facility, reporting directly to the Japanese Army Medical Service headquarters in Manila. His staff consisted of 6 medical officers, 12 enlisted medical personnel, and 20 guards. Internal reports showed Yamamoto requesting additional research subjects and receiving authorization to expand operations in September 1944. Lieutenant Kozlowski discovered correspondence that indicated the San Teodoro facility was not unique. References in captured documents mentioned similar operations in Luzon and coordination with research facilities in occupied territories. The implication was staggering: this might be part of a network of experimentation centers throughout the Japanese-occupied Philippines. The most incriminating evidence came from Yamamoto's personal journal, found in his abandoned quarters. Unlike the clinical research notes, the journal contained his private reflections. Entries from May 1944 discussed acceptable mortality rates and the necessity of sacrifice for scientific advancement. He wrote about the inferior nature of the subject population and how their use in research served the greater purpose of the empire. But perhaps most revealing were entries from November 1944, as American forces approached. Yamamoto wrote about receiving orders to destroy evidence and eliminate remaining subjects. Command insists on complete sanitization, he noted. No witnesses, no records. But the research data is too valuable to destroy entirely. I will attempt to preserve core findings while disposing of physical evidence. That entry explained why some files had been hastily burned while others remained. Yamamoto had tried to save the scientific data while eliminating proof of the human cost. He had failed at both, interrupted by the faster-than-expected American advance that forced his evacuation before he could complete the destruction. The CID team also documented the burial sites. Survivors had indicated approximate locations where they heard guards discussing disposal of bodies. Ground-penetrating equipment borrowed from Army engineers identified disturbances in the soil. Excavation revealed mass graves containing remains of at least 67 individuals, many showing signs of medical intervention, surgical incisions, injection sites, evidence of organ removal. Image prompts. Old black and white photo of CID investigators in military uniforms photographing documents spread across tables, evidence tags visible, professional documentation set up with lighting equipment. Old black and white photo of Army photographer capturing images of examination table with restraints, camera on tripod. Stark lighting highlighting the clinical brutality of the equipment. Old black and white photo of Nisei translator at desk surrounded by stacks of Japanese documents, making notes. Dictionary open, concentrated expression under single overhead light. Old black and white photo of investigators examining Japanese officer's personal journal, pages spread open showing handwritten entries, magnifying glass in use. Old black and white photo of Army engineers operating ground-penetrating equipment in field outside compound, soldiers marking locations with stakes, tropical vegetation visible. Old black and white photo of excavation site with covered remains being carefully documented. Military personnel and protective gear, evidence markers placed, solemn atmosphere captured. Lieutenant Colonel Hartwell ordered flashlights brought forward. At 0812 hours, he led a detail of 6 men down the staircase into what Army records would later classify as Medical Experimentation Facility, San Teodoro. The basement extended far beyond the footprint of the building above, approximately 4,000 square feet of underground chambers carved into the volcanic rock beneath the compound. The first room they entered had been designed as a laboratory. Benches lined the walls, covered with scientific equipment, microscopes, centrifuges, glass beakers still containing residues of unknown substances. But it was the examination tables that captured their attention. 4 steel tables, each equipped with leather restraints at the wrists, ankles, and neck. Dark stains covered the surfaces, stains that laboratory analysis would later confirm as human blood of multiple types. Captain Walsh's official report, filed December 20, 1944, documented the systematic layout of the facility. The main laboratory connected to 6 smaller rooms, each serving a specific function in what appeared to be a carefully planned research program. One room contained refrigeration units filled with biological samples preserved in formaldehyde. The labels, translated by the Nisei interpreters, identified tissues from human organs, liver, kidney, lung, brain. Each sample was tagged with a number corresponding to the files found upstairs. But it was the 4th chamber that provided the most damning evidence. This room had been converted into a makeshift hospital ward, 12 beds arranged in 2 rows, each equipped with intravenous stands and monitoring equipment. Medical charts hung at the foot of each bed, tracking vital signs and symptoms. According to Army Medical Corps analysis conducted the following week, the charts documented deliberate infection of Filipino civilians with various diseases, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and others they couldn't immediately identify. The Japanese researchers had been studying disease progression under controlled conditions, using living human beings as test subjects. They had infected healthy Filipino civilians, withheld treatment, and methodically recorded their deterioration and death. The precision of the documentation was chilling. Temperature readings every 4 hours. Detailed descriptions of symptoms. Photographs of physical manifestations. All recorded with the clinical detachment of laboratory scientists studying rats. Staff Sergeant DeMarco discovered the evidence that would later prove crucial in war crimes prosecutions. In a locked metal cabinet, he found personal effects, watches, rings, identification papers, belonging to 183 individuals. Each item was tagged with the same numbering system used in the medical files. These weren't anonymous subjects. The Japanese had kept meticulous records of exactly who they had experimented upon. Private Kozlowski found himself translating research notes that detailed something even more disturbing. The experiments weren't random sadism, they were part of a systematic research program. Internal memoranda referenced valuable data for mainland operations and applications for tropical disease management in occupied territories. The Japanese military medical establishment had been using Filipino civilians to develop treatments and preventive measures for their own troops, sacrificing the occupied population to protect their soldiers. The facility's ventilation system, they discovered, had been carefully designed. Fresh air intakes were positioned to serve only the research staff areas. The patient ward had minimal ventilation, apparently to study how poor air circulation affected disease transmission and progression. Even the environmental conditions were part of the experiment. At 0945 hours, the patrol made a discovery that transformed the investigation from historical documentation to immediate humanitarian crisis. In the farthest chamber of the underground facility, behind another locked door, they found 17 Filipino civilians still alive. The survivors were in catastrophic condition. According to Army Medical Corps records, their average weight was 63 pounds, approximately 40% below normal body weight for their heights. 12 showed signs of active disease infection. All exhibited symptoms of severe malnutrition, dehydration, and psychological trauma. Several were too weak to stand. 2 were unconscious. Captain Walsh immediately radioed for medical evacuation. The 41st Medical Battalion arrived at 1,115 hours with portable stretchers and emergency supplies. Major Robert Kenilworth, the battalion surgeon, later testified that in 15 years of medical practice, he had never encountered civilians in such systematically degraded physical condition. These weren't war casualties, his official report stated. These were laboratory specimens being kept barely alive for continued experimentation. The survivors' testimonies, collected over the following weeks as they recovered, revealed the full scope of the Japanese program. The facility had been operational since March 1942, shortly after Japanese forces secured control of Mindanao. Filipino civilians had been systematically rounded up from surrounding villages under various pretexts: labor conscription, rice requisition, compliance checks, identification verification. Those selected met specific criteria documented in the Japanese files: ages 18 to 45, no immediate family connections to resistance groups, residents of villages with minimal external contact. Rosa Delgado, a 28-year-old schoolteacher from Malabog, provided testimony that Army investigators recorded on December 22, 1944. She had been brought to the facility in August 1944 after Japanese military police claimed to need her translation skills. Instead, she was infected with an unknown pathogen and confined to the ward. "They treated us like we were not human," her translated testimony stated. Every day, the doctors would come. They would measure, photograph, take blood. They wrote everything in their notebooks. When someone died, they would make notes and then bring in someone new. The Japanese medical staff had maintained careful protocols. Each subject received identical caloric intake, barely enough to sustain life. Disease progression was monitored without intervention. Pain management was minimal, apparently to avoid interfering with symptomatic observation. The research staff maintained detailed journals documenting their findings, journals that Army intelligence would later use as evidence in war crimes tribunals. Private First Class Kozlowski's translations revealed internal communications between the San Teodoro facility and Japanese Medical Command in Manila. The exchanges discussed significant breakthroughs in tropical disease adaptation and valuable preventive protocols derived from human trials. Orders from Manila explicitly authorized continued research operations with local population subjects and emphasized the strategic importance of data acquisition. The 17 survivors represented a fraction of those who had passed through the facility. Cross-referencing the personal effects with the medical files indicated at least 183 individuals had been subjected to experimentation. The survivors confirmed that bodies of those who died were removed at night and buried in unmarked locations. They heard the Japanese researchers discussing the need to eliminate evidence should American forces approach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Criminal Investigation Division arrived at San Teodoro on December 19, 1944, led by Lieutenant Colonel James Rutherford, a former prosecutor from Philadelphia now assigned to document Japanese war crimes in the Pacific Theater. His team consisted of 8 investigators, 3 photographers, and 4 Nisei translators. Their mission: preserve every piece of evidence that could support future prosecutions. Rutherford's methodology, documented in official CID reports, followed strict evidentiary protocols. Every document was photographed in situ before removal. Each piece of laboratory equipment was catalogued with detailed descriptions of its condition and apparent use. The examination tables, the restraints, the monitoring devices, all were documented with the precision of a criminal investigation, because that's exactly what this was. The photographic evidence proved particularly damning. Army photographers spent 3 days capturing every detail of the facility. The images showed the clinical efficiency of the operation, the organized filing system, the carefully maintained equipment, the systematic layout of the ward. But they also captured the human cost, the stained examination tables, the tiny portions of food allocated to subjects, the cells where prisoners were held between experiments. The document translation effort revealed the administrative structure behind the atrocities. Major Hiroshi Yamamoto had commanded the facility, reporting directly to the Japanese Army Medical Service headquarters in Manila. His staff consisted of 6 medical officers, 12 enlisted medical personnel, and 20 guards. Internal reports showed Yamamoto requesting additional research subjects and receiving authorization to expand operations in September 1944. Lieutenant Kozlowski discovered correspondence that indicated the San Teodoro facility was not unique. References in captured documents mentioned similar operations in Luzon and coordination with research facilities in occupied territories. The implication was staggering. This might be part of a network of experimentation centers throughout the Japanese-occupied Philippines. The most incriminating evidence came from Yamamoto's personal journal, found in his abandoned quarters. Unlike the clinical research notes, the journal contained his private reflections. Entries from May 1944 discussed acceptable mortality rates and the necessity of sacrifice for scientific advancement. He wrote about the inferior nature of the subject population and how their use in research served the greater purpose of the empire. But perhaps most revealing were entries from November 1944, as American forces approached. Yamamoto wrote about receiving orders to destroy evidence and eliminate remaining subjects. Command insists on complete sanitization, he noted. No witnesses, no records. But the research data is too valuable to destroy entirely. I will attempt to preserve core findings while disposing of physical evidence. That entry explained why some files had been hastily burned while others remained. Yamamoto had tried to save the scientific data while eliminating proof of the human cost. He had failed at both, interrupted by the faster-than-expected American advance that forced his evacuation before he could complete the destruction. The CID team also documented the burial sites. Survivors had indicated approximate locations where they heard guards discussing disposal of bodies. Ground-penetrating equipment borrowed from Army engineers identified disturbances in the soil. Excavation revealed mass graves containing remains of at least 67 individuals, many showing signs of medical intervention, surgical incisions, injection sites, evidence of organ removal. The pursuit of Major Yamamoto became a priority for Army intelligence. His knowledge of the experimentation program and potential connections to other facilities made him a critical target for interrogation. The 41st Infantry Division's intelligence section coordinated with Filipino resistance groups who had been tracking Japanese movements during their retreat toward Davao. On December 28, 1944, guerrilla forces intercepted a Japanese column attempting to evacuate through the interior highlands. Among the captured personnel were 3 medical officers from the San Teodoro facility, including Captain Takeshi Nakamura, Yamamoto's second-in-command. Major Yamamoto himself had evaded capture, but Nakamura's interrogation would prove equally valuable. The interrogation transcripts, declassified in 1975, revealed Nakamura's complete cooperation once confronted with the documentary evidence. Unlike some Japanese officers who refused to acknowledge war crimes, Nakamura provided detailed testimony, apparently believing that his scientific contributions justified the methods employed. His rationale, as recorded by interrogators, reflected a worldview that prioritized military necessity over human rights. According to Nakamura's testimony, the program had originated from a directive issued by the Japanese Army Medical Service in late 1941. The directive authorized research into tropical disease management using available population resources in occupied territories. The language was deliberately vague, but the intent was clear: use conquered peoples as experimental subjects to develop treatments protecting Japanese troops. Nakamura described the selection process with clinical detachment. We required subjects who would not be immediately missed, his translated testimony stated. Village populations in remote areas provided optimal resources. We avoided taking individuals with strong family connections or community positions. The selected subjects represented minimal disruption to local labor capacity while providing necessary research opportunities. The medical protocols Nakamura detailed demonstrated systematic dehumanization. Subjects were assigned numbers, not names. Medical charts referenced specimens rather than patients. The research staff were instructed to maintain emotional distance, treating the work as pure scientific inquiry. "We were told this was no different from animal research," Nakamura testified. The subjects were serving the empire through their participation in advancing medical knowledge. But Nakamura's testimony also revealed fractures within the Japanese medical staff. 2 officers had apparently objected to the program's scope, questioning whether the research violated medical ethics. Both had been reassigned to combat units, effectively punished for their reluctance to participate. The remaining staff either genuinely believed in the program's scientific value or suppressed their objections to avoid similar consequences. Radio intercepts decoded by Allied intelligence provided additional context. Messages between Yamamoto and Manila headquarters discussed maintaining research schedules despite advancing enemy forces and preservation of critical data for post-war analysis. As late as December 15, 1944, 2 days before the American discovery, Manila was ordering the San Teodoro facility to continue operations until final evacuation becomes unavoidable. Perhaps most disturbing were Nakamura's revelations about the program's intended expansion. Plans existed for establishing similar facilities throughout Southeast Asia. Documents he had seen referenced standardized research protocols for occupied territories and coordinated data collection across the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The San Teodoro facility was meant to be a model for a vast network of human experimentation centers. The psychological impact on American personnel who discovered and documented the San Teodoro facility was profound and long-lasting. Army medical records from early 1945 documented a significant increase in combat stress reactions among soldiers involved in the investigation, even compared to frontline infantry units experiencing active combat. Captain Theodore Walsh, the intelligence officer who first entered the facility, began experiencing severe nightmares within 3 days of the discovery. His medical file, declassified decades later, noted recurrent dreams of underground chambers and intrusive memories of photographic evidence. By January 15, 1945, Walsh had been evacuated to a rear area hospital for psychiatric evaluation. He never returned to combat duty. Staff Sergeant William DeMarco, who had led the initial patrol, struggled with what military psychiatrists termed moral injury, psychological trauma resulting from witnessing actions that violated deeply held ethical beliefs. His letters home, preserved in the National Archives, reveal his struggle to comprehend what he had seen. "How do you explain to people back home that human beings did this to other human beings?" he wrote to his wife. "The Japs we fight on the battlefield, I can understand. But this was something else entirely." The Nisei interpreters faced a unique burden. Private First Class Eugene Koslowski and his fellow translators had to spend weeks reading detailed accounts of atrocities committed by forces ethnically similar to themselves, despite their American loyalty. Their service records note requests for reassignment and documented instances of what would now be recognized as secondary traumatic stress, psychological harm from exposure to others' trauma narratives. Army chaplains assigned to the 41st Division reported unprecedented demand for counseling services following the San Teodoro discovery. Father Vincent O'Brien, a Catholic chaplain who had served since Guadalcanal, noted in his report that soldiers were struggling with fundamental questions about human nature and divine justice. They had seen terrible things in combat, O'Brien wrote, but combat made sense in its own terrible logic. This facility represented something beyond their conceptual framework for warfare. The Filipino survivors' recovery process presented its own challenges. Army medical personnel had extensive experience treating physical wounds but limited training in addressing systematic psychological trauma. The survivors exhibited what doctors described as profound dissociation and emotional numbing, symptoms consistent with what would later be classified as post-traumatic stress disorder. Rosa Delgado's recovery particularly concerned medical staff. Despite her physical improvement, she rarely spoke and showed minimal emotional response to her liberation. Her medical file noted, "Patient seems unable to process that experimentation has ended. Continues to expect medical staff to conduct research procedures. Demonstrates fear response to routine medical care." The command structure grappled with how to handle the discovery. General Douglas MacArthur, informed of the facility on December 20, 1944, immediately ordered preservation of all evidence for war crimes prosecutions. But he also recognized the potential psychological impact on American forces if details became widely known. His directive emphasized documentation for legal purposes while restricting dissemination of graphic details that might affect troop morale. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The legal framework for prosecuting the San Teodoro atrocities began taking shape in January 1945, even as combat operations continued across the Philippines. The Judge Advocate General's Office established a special war crimes investigation unit specifically focused on medical experimentation cases. Lieutenant Colonel James Rutherford was appointed chief prosecutor, leveraging his civilian experience handling complex criminal cases in Philadelphia's district attorney's office. The evidentiary foundation was unprecedented in military justice history. Unlike many war crimes cases that relied primarily on witness testimony, the San Teodoro prosecution possessed extensive documentary evidence created by the perpetrators themselves. The 847 case files, research journals, photographic records, and internal correspondence provided an unassailable paper trail directly linking specific individuals to specific crimes. Rutherford's prosecutorial strategy, outlined in memoranda dated January 1945, focused on establishing a clear chain of command and demonstrating systematic intent rather than isolated incidents of misconduct. The evidence showed that Major Hiroshi Yamamoto had not acted independently but had operated within an authorized framework extending to Japanese military medical headquarters in Manila and potentially beyond. The search for Yamamoto intensified throughout January and February 1945. Intelligence reports placed him in the Davao region, attempting to evacuate to Japan with other high-ranking personnel. Filipino resistance networks, coordinated by American liaison officers, established surveillance on potential escape routes. The resistance fighters had particular motivation, many had lost family members to the facility or similar operations. On February 14, 1945, guerrilla forces cornered a Japanese evacuation convoy in the mountains west of Davao. The firefight lasted 40 minutes. When American advisors arrived to process captured personnel, they found Yamamoto among the prisoners. He had been wounded in the leg during the engagement but would survive to face trial. Yamamoto's interrogation, conducted over 6 days beginning February 16, revealed the extent of his conviction that the research had been justified. Unlike Captain Nakamura, who had shown some recognition of ethical violations, Yamamoto remained defiant. Interrogation transcripts record his assertion that the research advanced medical knowledge essential to Japanese military operations, and that the sacrifice of inferior populations served the greater imperial purpose. His testimony confirmed the program's scope extended beyond San Teodoro. He identified 4 similar facilities in Luzon, 2 in Cebu, and referenced coordinated operations in other occupied territories. Each facility operated under the same protocols: selection of subjects from occupied populations, systematic experimentation with diseases and medical procedures, meticulous documentation of results, and disposal of evidence when threatened by Allied advances. The legal proceedings formally commenced on April 2, 1945, in Manila, recently liberated from Japanese occupation. The tribunal consisted of 5 senior American military officers experienced in both combat operations and legal proceedings. The prosecution presented evidence over 17 days, calling 43 witnesses including survivors, American personnel who discovered the facility, and captured Japanese medical staff. Rosa Delgado provided the most emotionally powerful testimony. Speaking through a translator on April 8, she described her 8 months of systematic torture disguised as medical research. They would infect us with diseases and watch us suffer, her testimony stated. They would take notes while we begged for medicine they had but would not give us. When someone died, they would dissect the body to see what the disease had done. Then they would bring in someone new and start again. The defense attorneys, assigned American military lawyers, argued that the defendants had been following orders from superior authority and that military necessity in wartime justified extreme measures. The tribunal rejected these arguments, citing international law principles established after World War I that individual responsibility could not be absolved by claims of following orders, particularly for acts that violated fundamental human dignity. The documentary evidence proved overwhelming. Yamamoto's own research journals, his correspondence with Manila headquarters, the detailed case files, all demonstrated not only knowledge of what was occurring but enthusiastic participation in expanding the program's scope and scientific rigor. On April 26, 1945, after 7 hours of deliberation, the tribunal returned with verdicts. Major Hiroshi Yamamoto was found guilty on all charges: crimes against humanity, violations of the laws and customs of war, and conspiracy to commit war crimes. The tribunal determined that his actions constituted systematic torture and murder under the guise of medical research. The sentence was death by hanging. Captain Takeshi Nakamura and 4 other medical officers received varying sentences based on their level of participation and authority. Nakamura's cooperation with investigators earned him a reduction from death to life imprisonment. The other officers received sentences ranging from 15 years to death, depending on the tribunal's assessment of their individual culpability and command responsibility. The tribunal's written judgment, spanning 127 pages, established important legal precedents that would influence war crimes jurisprudence for decades. The panel explicitly rejected the notion that military or scientific objectives could justify the use of unconsenting human subjects in medical experimentation. No claimed advancement of knowledge, the judgment stated, can excuse the systematic degradation and destruction of human life. Medical science built upon such foundations is not progress but barbarism clothed in clinical language. Yamamoto's execution occurred on June 8, 1945, at Bilibid Prison in Manila. According to official records, he showed no remorse in his final statement, asserting that history would vindicate his research contributions. He went to the gallows maintaining that the experiments had produced valuable medical data that advanced scientific understanding of tropical diseases, a claim that post-war medical reviews would thoroughly discredit. The aftermath of the San Teodoro discovery rippled through multiple dimensions of the war's conclusion and post-war reconstruction. General Douglas MacArthur ordered systematic searches for similar facilities throughout liberated areas of the Philippines. Between January and August 1945, American forces discovered 6 additional experimentation centers, though none matched the scale or documentation level of San Teodoro. The evidence from these facilities contributed to the broader war crimes prosecutions conducted during the post-war period. Japanese military medical personnel faced tribunals in Manila, Tokyo, and other locations. The precedents established in the Yamamoto trial influenced how prosecutors approached cases involving medical experimentation and the abuse of civilian populations under occupation. For the Filipino survivors, the path to recovery proved long and difficult. The 17 individuals rescued from San Teodoro received ongoing medical care from U.S. Army medical facilities through 1946. Physical rehabilitation was relatively straightforward compared to psychological healing. Many survivors struggled with what military psychiatrists termed experimentation trauma syndrome, a specific pattern of symptoms including hypervigilance around medical personnel, recurring nightmares of the facility, and profound difficulty trusting authority figures. Rosa Delgado eventually returned to teaching in 1948, though she never fully recovered from her ordeal. Her testimony at the tribunal had been cathartic but also re-traumatizing. She spent the remainder of her life, she died in 1987, advocating for recognition of Filipino suffering during the occupation and for compensation for victims of Japanese war crimes. Her collected writings, preserved in the Philippine National Archives, provide some of the most detailed survivor accounts of medical experimentation during World War II. The discovery of San Teodoro also influenced American military medical ethics policies. The Army Medical Department established formal protocols prohibiting experimentation on unconsenting subjects and requiring ethical review of all research involving human participants. These policies, developed in 1946, represented direct responses to the horrors documented at San Teodoro and similar facilities. International medical organizations used the San Teodoro evidence in developing post-war ethical guidelines. The World Medical Association, established in 1947, explicitly referenced Japanese medical war crimes when drafting the Declaration of Geneva, which required physicians to pledge that humanitarian concerns would supersede all other considerations, a direct repudiation of the utilitarian justifications offered by Yamamoto and others. The full scope of Japanese medical experimentation in the Philippines emerged gradually through decades of historical research and declassification of military records. What began with the discovery at San Teodoro in December 1944 eventually revealed a network of at least 12 facilities operating throughout the occupied Philippines between 1942 and 1945. Conservative estimates suggest over 2,000 Filipino civilians were subjected to medical experimentation, with mortality rates exceeding 80%. The historical reckoning with these crimes proved complex and politically fraught. During the immediate post-war period, the United States prioritized Japanese cooperation in countering Soviet influence in Asia. Some medical officers who participated in experimentation programs received lenient treatment or avoided prosecution entirely in exchange for sharing research data. This compromise, declassified documents from the 1970s revealed, allowed some perpetrators to escape justice while their victims remained unacknowledged. Filipino survivors and their families campaigned for decades for official recognition and compensation. The Philippine government established a War Victims Compensation Commission in 1951, but bureaucratic obstacles and limited funding meant many legitimate claimants never received assistance. Rosa Delgado testified before the commission in 1953, providing detailed accounts that helped establish verification protocols for other survivors seeking recognition. The San Teodoro site itself became a memorial in 1965, 2 decades after its liberation. The Philippine Historical Commission, working with survivors in the local community, converted the facility into a museum documenting Japanese medical war crimes. The underground chambers were preserved as they were found, with explanatory materials helping visitors understand what had occurred. The museum's mission statement commits to ensuring that the suffering endured here will serve as eternal testimony against the dehumanization of any people under any circumstances. Annual remembrance ceremonies began in 1970, bringing together Filipino survivors, their families, and American veterans who had discovered the facility. These gatherings served both commemorative and educational purposes. Younger generations learned directly from those who had experienced or witnessed the atrocities, ensuring historical memory would persist beyond the survivors' lifetimes. The last American veteran who participated in the discovery, former Staff Sergeant William DeMarco, attended the 60th anniversary ceremony in 2004. His speech, preserved in the museum archives, reflected on the burden of witnessing such crimes. "We saved 17 people that day," he said, "but we couldn't save the hundreds who died before we arrived. That knowledge stays with you forever. But we can honor them by ensuring no one forgets what happened here." Historical scholarship on San Teodoro and similar facilities expanded significantly after archival declassification in the 1990s and 2000s. Researchers gained access to complete tribunal records, intelligence reports, and captured Japanese documents. These materials enabled comprehensive analysis of how military medical establishments became instruments of systematic human rights violations. The ethical implications continue to resonate in contemporary medical research and military policy. The San Teodoro case appears prominently in military medical ethics training, illustrating how institutional authority and ideological conviction can override individual moral responsibility. The facility serves as a cautionary example of what becomes possible when scientific inquiry divorces itself from fundamental human dignity. In 2015, the 70th anniversary of the facility's liberation saw the installation of a memorial wall bearing the names of all identified victims. The wall includes 847 names recovered from Japanese records, though researchers believe many victims remain unidentified. Each name is accompanied by what limited information exists: age, village of origin, Date of imprisonment. For those whose names were never recorded, the wall includes blank spaces representing the anonymous dead, the individuals reduced to numbers in research files. Today, the San Teodoro Memorial Museum receives approximately 30,000 visitors annually. School groups, researchers, and international visitors walk through the preserved underground chambers, confronting physical evidence of systematic dehumanization. The museum's educational programs emphasize not just historical documentation but contemporary relevance, asking visitors to consider how such atrocities become possible and what responsibilities individuals bear to resist institutional evil. The legacy of San Teodoro extends beyond historical memory to active engagement with ongoing human rights challenges. The Memorial Foundation, established by survivors and their descendants, supports education programs throughout Southeast Asia focusing on medical ethics, human rights, and the dangers of dehumanizing ideologies. Rosa Delgado, before her death in 1987, established a scholarship fund for Filipino students pursuing medical careers, with recipients required to study medical ethics and the historical abuses that make such study necessary. The San Teodoro revelation did not occur in isolation but formed part of a larger pattern of Japanese military medical crimes that extended across occupied Asia. As Allied forces liberated territories throughout 1945, similar facilities emerged in China, Burma, Singapore, and Indonesia. The systematic nature of these operations suggested coordination at the highest levels of Japanese military medical command, transforming what might have seemed like isolated incidents into evidence of institutional policy. Intelligence analysts working for the Supreme Commander Allied powers compared documentation from multiple sites. The similarities were striking and disturbing. Facilities across different regions employed identical selection criteria for subjects, used the same experimental protocols, and maintained comparable record-keeping systems. Internal Japanese military communications, intercepted and decoded throughout 1945, revealed that research data from various facilities was being consolidated at Medical Research Headquarters in Tokyo. The most notorious of these operations was Unit 731 in Manchuria, commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. American intelligence discovered this facility in August 1945, finding evidence of experiments that dwarfed even San Teodoro in scale and brutality. The Manchurian operation had experimented on an estimated 3,000 to 12,000 subjects, primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, testing biological weapons, conducting vivisections, and studying the limits of human survival under extreme conditions. The connection between Unit 731 and facilities like San Teodoro became clear through captured documentation. Officers from Ishii's command had visited Philippine facilities in 1943, providing technical guidance and standardizing protocols. The San Teodoro staff had submitted quarterly reports to Unit 731 headquarters, contributing their findings to a centralized database of human experimentation results. Major Yamamoto's research journals contained multiple references to coordination with Manchurian operations and integration of tropical disease data with mainland research. This revelation complicated post-war justice proceedings significantly. American authorities faced a troubling choice: prosecute all perpetrators, including those whose research data might prove valuable to U.S. military medical programs, or grant immunity in exchange for exclusive access to experimental results. Declassified documents from 1947 show that several high-ranking Unit 731 personnel, including some with knowledge of Philippine operations, received immunity from prosecution in exchange for sharing research data with American military scientists. General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters justified this decision in classified memoranda by arguing that Soviet forces had already captured some Japanese medical personnel and were likely obtaining similar data. The emerging Cold War context, these documents argued, made it strategically necessary to secure Japanese medical research findings before the Soviets could monopolize them. The ethical cost, allowing war criminals to escape justice, was deemed acceptable given perceived national security requirements. Filipino and Chinese representatives at early United Nations discussions protested these immunity agreements vehemently. Philippine Foreign Secretary Carlos Romulo delivered a passionate speech to the UN General Assembly in 1948, arguing that justice delayed for strategic convenience is justice denied to victims whose suffering demands accountability regardless of geopolitical considerations. His protests, while noted in official records, did not alter American policy. The international legal framework that emerged from World War II tribunals, including the Nuremberg Code established in 1947, drew heavily on evidence from medical experimentation cases like San Teodoro. The Code's 10 principles for ethical human research, requiring voluntary consent, avoiding unnecessary suffering, and ensuring scientific qualification of researchers, represented direct responses to the systematic violations documented in Japanese and Nazi medical programs. The San Teodoro evidence specifically influenced Article 7 of the Nuremberg Code, which addressed experiments involving potential death or disability. Tribunal documents cited Yamamoto's research protocols as examples of categorically impermissible research, regardless of claimed scientific or military value. The Filipino survivors' testimonies helped establish that vulnerability of subject populations, whether due to occupation, imprisonment, or other forms of powerlessness, created absolute prohibitions against experimentation rather than merely requiring additional safeguards. International medical organizations struggled with how to address the complicity of medical professionals in war crimes. The World Medical Association's 1948 Declaration of Geneva required physicians to pledge that humanitarian considerations would supersede national, racial, religious, or political considerations. This language directly repudiated the utilitarian nationalism that had enabled doctors like Yamamoto to justify atrocities as serving the greater good of their nation. The long-term impact on international humanitarian law was profound. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 included specific protections against medical experimentation on persons in custody or under occupation. Article 32 of the Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibited medical or scientific experiments not necessitated by the medical treatment of a protected person and classified such acts as grave breaches warranting universal jurisdiction for prosecution. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.